I'm Simon Lyster. I'm a member of Essex County Council's Climate Action Commission. I'm also a non-executive director of Essex and Suffolk Water, which is part of the Northumbrian Water Group. I'm a trustee of various charities, particularly wildlife charities, both here in the UK, but also internationally. I'm actually a lawyer by background, but I grew up here on a farm in Essex. I've been fascinated with wildlife my whole life, cared about wildlife conservation my whole life, and indeed have spent most of my career as a lawyer, but working in nature conservation. It's interesting. I mean, I grew up on the edge of Haneyfield Reservoir in Essex, and I am passionate about wildlife and always have been, but decided to become a lawyer largely because I couldn't really think what else to do. But then very quickly thought, do you know what? I'm going to be a lawyer for conservation. But in those days, there really weren't too many lawyers around. And I went to the World Wildlife Fund and I said, look, I'm a lawyer and I want to help for wildlife conservation. What can I do? And they, this is going back a long time, in the late 70s, said, lawyers, we don't need lawyers. So I thought, I'm going to show them. So I realized that actually there were all these emerging international treaties that were coming up to dealing with trade in endangered species called CITES, and then there's one on wetlands called the Ramsar Convention, and there was no information about that anywhere. So I was desperate to get into conservation. So I thought, I'll write a book about international treaties that are concerned with wildlife and are becoming more and more important. Anyway, having done that, it then got published, and I went back to WWF and they said, okay, well, maybe you can come and work for us and help get these international treaties working better and better enforced. And that's how I started. And, I've been working in wildlife conservation, both internationally and in the UK ever since. So actually that book, dry as it sounds, actually got me my first job in conservation. And I've had a wonderful and very interesting life ever since. Really pleased to be a member of Essex County Council's Climate Action Commission, and I actually think it could do an incredibly important role, because as a country we've committed in the UK to be net zero for carbon emissions by 2050, and what Essex County Council wants to do is to be a leading local authority in the country in terms of can we get there quicker than 2050. And so it's pulled together a bunch of different people from different backgrounds to help advise it on how Essex can become net zero carbon before 2050. And it's great being part of that group. And I think it could be very influential, particularly because the UK is going to be hosting the meeting internationally of the climate convention countries next year in 2021. And I think it's very important that the UK can show there's a whole load of stuff happening here to try and meet this international 2050 target, so that other countries are going to take any notice of what we're doing. And if we want the whole world to become carbon neutral, which we do, then we need to show that we're taking those steps, because as a country, we've clearly got the resources and the commitment and the interest amongst people to do it. So I think if we can help set an example here in the UK, and if we can do it here in Essex, that would be really fantastic. The current planning process is not good enough in terms of the due consideration it should give to biodiversity, and that's one of the problems. But, and this is the good news, in the Environment Bill, which is currently going through Parliament and is likely to become law next spring, there will be an obligation on all developments to come up with a plan for how they are actually going to enhance biodiversity by at least 10%. It's called biodiversity net gain, and that's going to be a condition of any future planning. So although at the moment I don't think the system's adequate, I'm actually quite optimistic that in future we'll see development actually contributing to biodiversity gain. I think that's not only going to be good for wildlife, but it'll also be good for people who are living in houses where there's been a deliberate effort to try and make make sure that the environment around those houses is actually slightly richer in wildlife, and that will be much better from an amenity point of view. So I think that in future, we will get more development, but we will see it done in a more wildlife friendly way, which I think will be great. I think we should have a commissioner for future generations. I mean, look at the impact that Greta Thunberg has had. It's been transformational in terms of raising the awareness amongst a whole range of people that climate change is really important and really needs to be tackled seriously if we want our sort of way of living to carry on in anything like the same way it has so far. And I think that having the voice of youth is incredibly important. They are the future. And I think we need to listen to the young and not have old buffers like I am, unfortunately, these days. So absolutely, we should have a youth commissioner, and we should be giving the voice of the youth much greater importance than we do at the minute. Relationship between agriculture and wildlife in the UK is probably the biggest, most important factor as to what happens to wildlife in the future. And it's because we've had intensive agriculture over the last, well, really since the Second World War, when, the motto was plough for victory, because we wanted to be self-sufficient in food. And great, we are self-sufficient in food, and food has been cheap, but it has had a catastrophic impact on biodiversity. There's no question about it. I mean, the science is very clear on that. But again, fortunately, this message has got across, and government is clear that it wants a future support system for farming, which is going to encourage and incentivize much more environmentally friendly farming systems, and creating space for nature, for ponds, for woodland, for meadows, for all kinds of things that will help wildlife. So the direction of travel that the government has said it wants to do in the future is much more encouraging than it has been in the past. So again, I'm quite hopeful that actually in the future, we will have a system that supports farming to produce food, which we all need, and there needs to be an appropriate balance, but also is going to be much richer in wildlife. And I think there's a real opportunity to achieve that. So I'm actually sort of quite excited about it. And if you think of England, you think of it being very built up, but actually between 60 and 70% of England, and even here in Essex, but more than 60% of Essex land is farmland. So if we can get the way farming is done that is good for wildlife and produces food, that really is going to be the key factor for the future of wildlife. International governments are great at making commitments, but they're not always so good at keeping them. For example, we have an international convention on biological diversity, and in 2010 they set all kinds of ambitious targets for reducing biodiversity loss, for protecting forests, having more protected areas by 2020. Did it happen? No. And in 2020, they actually haven't been able to meet this year because of the pandemic, but they will be meeting next year. And the proposal is to have a whole lot of more ambitious targets for 2030, which is great. Nothing wrong with that. But what we do need to have is a much bigger focus on implementation. And I'm actually great that the UK has said that it wants to see 30% of the UK protected by 2030, and that is going to be one of the targets that the international convention has made. And we need to see more of that, of people setting these targets locally to reflect what's been agreed internationally, and then actually to deliver on it, actually to commit their promises.